Hello, everybody. This is so exciting for me. I love coming to Chicago, and this is the first time I've had a chance to come and visit to discuss my work as a journalist in the space of fashion. It's such an honor to be a part of the Chicago Humanities Festival, especially the inaugural Festival on Style. I also want to thank Stephanie for such a gracious introduction and for keeping me company today as I got ready for my talk. And I, of course, want to thank all of you for coming out. It's such a rainy, horrible day today, and if it were me, I probably would have just chosen to stay home and under my covers or something. So I really appreciate you guys making the effort to come out and think more critically through some of the issues that impact style. So I just want to start my talk by asking you guys to sort of keep a question in mind as I move through this presentation and as we discuss these topics after my talk, which is, do you think that humanity in general is moving forward? Are we progressing, accelerating into the future? Or have we somehow stalled out as a species and we're sort of regressing? Broad subject, I know. So I think about this question a lot in relation to fashion because in so many ways it demonstrates what is possible and what humanity is really capable of. Technology in particular is disrupting a lot of industries, and fashion is no exception. Right now, of course, we have technologists working on making costumes and dresses with LED lights. But in the future, we're going to see clothing that's not only capable of being stain resistant, but perhaps we'll see clothing that can actually clean itself. There are people who are working on clothes that will be able to harvest our energy as we move throughout our daily lives. And that energy might be used to power our smartphones, but maybe eventually it'll be used to help power our cities. And there are even people in the fashion industry, technologists working in the fashion industry, who imagine a future where we don't even have a reason to go out and buy new clothes because we'll maybe download new colors and patterns just as we do an app to our smartphone today. So these are the things that make me really excited about the future of fashion and incredibly optimistic about what people are capable of. But while we wait for that future, the reality that we're dealing with in the fashion industry is, of course, a much harsher one. And that reality is that the fashion industry is also simultaneously becoming much more dangerous, it's becoming deadlier, and it's becoming more environmentally pernicious. In fact, just in the last few years, we've seen 3 out of the 4 worst or deadliest, to be specific, accidents in the history of the garment industry. This is a picture taken inside the Tazreen factory in Bangladesh. It burned down in 2012, and more than 100 people, 100 garment workers, female garment workers, lost their lives that day. And then, of course, 1 year later, the Rana Plaza factory collapsed. And this was around this time of year in 2013. And Rana Plaza was a factory built inside basically an illegally built structure, obviously structurally unsound. And over 1,100 people died in that factory collapse. And that was, and still is, of course, the deadliest accident we've seen in the fashion industry. And in fact, it's one of the deadliest industrial accidents we've seen. It's certainly the worst accident from a structural collapse we've seen in modern human history. So what's clear is that for certain people in the fashion industry, things are somehow getting worse. But meanwhile, there are other people in the industry for whom things, the future, couldn't be brighter. Fashion used to be more of a mom and pop industry. It used to be much smaller scale and independently owned and run. And of course, some of you in here probably remember when we used to have a nation full of independently owned, beautiful department stores. But today's fashion industry is run primarily by huge global fashion corporations. And those corporations are enormously profitable in ways that previous generations probably couldn't have imagined. People who were participated in the fashion industry couldn't have imagined. So now we have the chairman of a fashion company is the second richest person in the world with a a net worth that actually outstrips the GDP of entire countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe. The chairman of H&M is the world's 17th richest person. He's Sweden's richest person, and his net worth over $20 billion, and not coincidentally, that is the profit that H&M is now earning on an annual basis. Meanwhile, garment workers are having a harder time than ever making a decent living, making the clothes that these companies are selling. So right now, workers in Bangladesh are making about $68 a month. And I know when I give these presentations, a lot of times people say, well, you know, sweatshops are sort of this integral part of the fashion industry, and eventually they'll go away, and it's just all part of the story of development. But we're not really seeing that kind of movement up the ladder anymore in a lot of countries. And in fact, garment worker wages around the world have stagnated in a lot of places. Between 2000 and 2011, in most countries that are making clothes, we didn't see an increase in wages at all. So in certain ways, progress has stalled out. I also want to point out that this doesn't have to be the case. And I know that to be true because if you look back in our own history, in the history of the American garment industry, things used to be very, very different. Even as far back as the 1930s, making clothes in some areas of the United States, it provided a middle-class income, not to mention a union job, and of course, a safe working environment. I was able to dig up a statistic from 1938 and found out that women working in the dress factories of New York City, the unionized factories, could make as much as $640 a week, and that's in today's dollars. And I mean, for me as a freelance writer, hearing that, I was like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. So yeah, something has changed. Something very fundamental and radical has happened to the fashion industry. And it's happened just in the last couple of decades. And I think part of understanding that transition has to do with fast fashion. So how many of you here had heard the term fast fashion before you came to the talk today? Okay, yeah, so maybe a quarter of you. So, and that's fantastic, doesn't matter either way. Fast fashion is sometimes used very narrowly to describe a type of retailing. It'll be used to describe a company like H&M or Forever 21 or Zara in this process that they go through of looking at what's on the catwalk. They observe what's happening at Fashion Week, and they very quickly knock off those designs and get those, they're sort of inspired by collections into stores months before the original collections. And that certainly is part of fast fashion, but I want to encourage everyone to think about it on a much broader scale, using a much broader definition. And that's to say that I think that fast fashion is a really perfect way to describe the massive acceleration in the cycle of the production, distribution, consumption, and disposal of clothing that we've seen over the last couple of decades. And that's not specific to H&M, it's not specific to Forever 21, it's not just specific to Zara. In fact, the entire retail industry is working to shorten lead times, turn over inventory faster, and get consumers into stores on an ongoing basis. And this is really different than the way the fashion industry used to work. Fashion was a seasonal industry for a very, very long time. And there are still high-end designers who will tell you that it is today as well. And when I say that it was seasonal, that would translate into maybe 2 to 4 collections of new clothes going into stores every year. And today, I would argue that there aren't seasons in fashion. There's a constant churn of new inventory, and that's true whether you're in a TJ Maxx or a Marshalls or a Kohl's or a Forever 21, even more traditional specialty stores like Gap and J. Crew are trying to borrow from this model. So my point being, you've shopped in a fast fashion chain, whether you know it or not, more than likely. There really isn't a mass market retailer out there that isn't trying to figure out how to turn their inventory over faster. And so really, in essence, speed and disposability have become the new black. So there are a couple of other ingredients that are important to mention about fast fashion, and one is this idea of sort of like novelty and variety. And you can see that when you walk into a store, most stores today, again, where it could be Marshalls, could be H&M. There's just so much choice now. And also, like, if you go into a store one week, it's probably going to look different than what you see the next week. And chains are using that as a marketing ploy now. So it's not enough that you bought clothes last season. They want you to know that they have something new for you to come in and get this week. And you can see that in the way H&M communicates with its customers on Twitter, reminding people that there's something new available every day. And indeed, it's not enough to shop seasonally anymore in the world of fast fashion. There's really this mantra of constant consumption. And I think it really breeds a certain kind of dissatisfaction with what we already have. And of course, the second ingredient of fast fashion is low price, because you can't shop all year round if clothes are expensive. And indeed, clothing, at least mass market clothing, is cheaper than ever before in history. It's edged up a little bit since a low point in 2008, but in general, as you can see, this is a pretty recent screen grab from H&M's homepage, where they're selling $4.99 outfits, $9.99 dresses. And fast fashion doesn't just get us excited about cheap stuff, it also changes our expectations about price. So it makes everything else seem expensive. Just a generation ago, buying something that cost $30, $40, $50, $100, $200 would have been far more commonplace. We wouldn't have necessarily seen that as pricey. Of course, we were shopping a lot less then too, so it wasn't as big of an ask. If people are only buying a couple of items a season, those prices aren't going to seem quite as shocking. But now, in order to keep up with this constant churn of new fads, the low price kind of has to be there in order for us to participate. But of course, there's another reason why we kind of give in to the game of fast fashion, and that's because when you're in a store and you get a deal on something that you like, it has a neurological impact on us. It feels good. In fact, it releases a lot of the same chemicals in our brains as drugs and alcohol. So just from that standpoint, shopping is a highly pleasurable activity. And sometimes when we're in a store and we're faced with something cheap and cute, we're doing it because we're responding to the deal, not necessarily because we really want that object. And I can tell you in my own life, every summer my mom and I go to the beach, and our first stop is always to Target to restock the beach house with whatever we need, paper towels, coffee filters. And without fail, I find myself edging over to the clothing section and being like, oh, I think, and all of a sudden I have a bathing suit, maybe 3 pairs of flip-flops for the price of one in my shopping cart. And and before I know it, I have all this stuff that I didn't really plan to buy, in my possession. So it's something that most of us have experienced. And of course, it spawned all sorts of bizarre consumer and extreme consumer behavior. My favorite example is haul videos. And for those of you who aren't familiar, haul videos are this YouTube phenomenon. It's mostly young women, young girls. They go out and they go shopping and they see how much clothing they can buy on whatever limited budget they have, and then they show it off on the internet. And this is stuck. There we go. And I mean, as the word implies, haul, the idea is to it's all about volume, quantity over quality, of course, in this case. So it's a system that really is designed to get us to buy stuff that we don't need. And I think that's really apparent when you look in the average American's closet. I know so many people who are like, I don't shop for fast fashion, I don't do any of this stuff. But then most of us have too much stuff in our closets. I've been working on this subject for 5 years, and I still have too much stuff in my closet. And in fact, consumer surveys show that we're only wearing about 30 to 50% of what's in our wardrobe. And when I started writing Overdressed, it was a much smaller percentage than that. It was maybe 10, 15% of the stuff that I had. Because if we're addicted to shopping, we're just out there buying new stuff, and it naturally displaces things that we already have. And also, other consumer surveys show that we're only wearing new garments about 7 times before it either gets displaced by something new, or it's considered out of date, or maybe we bought it and we just decide we don't really like it anymore. So what this has done is, we know what it's done in our own closets, in our personal lives, but fast fashion has to be looked at as a system and how it impacts our consumption as a society. And you can really see that when you start to look at the levels of consumption over time, because we're now buying 5 times more clothing as a country than we did in the 1980s. And Americans are actually the leaders in consumption of clothing. I find that sort of surprising because I don't think of Americans as being particularly fashion obsessed. This is not a criticism, but culturally we kind of lean more towards jeans and t-shirts, and I'm the same way. Yet we're still going out and buying a lot of jeans and t-shirts, and you can really see that in the numbers. But we're not alone. We are not alone. Fast fashion is spreading all around the world, and shopping for clothing as if it's disposable is a mindset that's spreading to other parts of the world. And it's happening in part because these more traditional fast fashion retailers are expanding to other parts of the globe. H&M boasts that they open more than 1 store per day on average around the world. Here they are opening in Guangzhou, which is in southern China. This Topshop, which is a UK fast fashion company, opening in Shenzhen, which is also in southern China. H&M opening in India. Zara opening in South Africa. And it works in reverse, too. We've got Primark in Boston now, which is a UK fast fashion brand that is, from what I hear, even cheaper than Forever 21. So, if you're interested. So yeah, it's not just us anymore. The world is now consuming 80 billion garments per year, and that's up 400% over the last 2 decades. And what's really, really troubling about these figures is that they're only going to get worse if we don't figure out how to slow this whole system down. In fact, India and China, which, as I know you all know, both have populations of over 1 billion people each. As those people become more affluent and they want to mirror the American consumer culture, the impact of these habits is only going to grow. And in fact, right now, China and India's clothing markets are predicted to outstrip ours in terms of levels of consumption and levels of sales as soon as 2020. Okay. So I took these pictures. I know they're not the prettiest things you've ever seen, but they're pictures that I took in my neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood in Brooklyn called Williamsburg, and I'm not going to pick on New Yorkers too much because I think we have it a little bit harder when we don't. A lot of us don't drive, so it's not like you can just put your old clothes in the car and drive them down to the Goodwill. And also, all of our Goodwills and Salvation Armies have been displaced by condos. So, but, so this is sort of the flip side of fast fashion. It's the other side of the coin. It's the side that we don't really think about, which is what happens when you turn clothing into a disposable good, you take the seasons out of fashion, and you encourage people to shop year-round. It increases the waste. I didn't mean to skip ahead to that, but yeah, it increases the amount of unwanted clothing in the world, and it increases the amount of waste. And in fact, textile waste that's just going into landfills has skyrocketed because of the way we're consuming now. It's increased actually by 40% just in the last 10 years. So actually the majority of unwanted clothes in the United States are going into the trash right now, which I find very strange. But I see it every day in my neighborhood, so I guess it's true. And then there's also the charities, what's happening to the charities. I think that, for many generations, we've looked at charities as a way to kind of have it both ways. You can buy something, and if you decide you don't like it or it gets a little bit worn out, at least there's someone in your community who is going to get some use out of it. But that perception is so far off from reality. And I first found this out when I was researching my book, Overdressed, and I spent some time in a Salvation Army in Brooklyn. And what I found out then is that charities are so inundated, and I'm talking about the big national charities. I'm not necessarily, if you have someone you use besides Salvation Army and Goodwill, I'm not necessarily speaking about how those charities work, but certainly the big national charities are so inundated with clothes that they couldn't possibly sell all of it in the United States. The current national averages are that they're able to sell about 20% of what they receive. And for the most part, anything that's wearable that they can't sell ends up being shipped to poor countries around the world, and it's resold in those countries. So I continued my kind of curiosity about this subject and ended up in Nairobi in January to get to know a little bit more about the secondhand markets there, which is where most of the clothes, as I said, that we donate in the United States end up. They end up in places like Nairobi. And this little kid is standing in front of a secondhand shoe stall in one of Nairobi's slums, and you can see there's like some pretty sweet looking Nikes hanging up in the back. And then the guy on the right, his name is Shadra, and he is one of the vendors in Nairobi's main secondhand clothing market. And you can see if you're familiar, if you shop at Salvation Army and Goodwill, you'll, and I think there's even a Savers tag still attached to the clothes. And that's a really common sight in Nairobi. And again, the textile waste issue is not ours alone to bear. In China, less than 10% of discarded textile products are currently being recycled. I think that the real elephant in the room with fast fashion, and the thing that we have to confront perhaps more than any other problem it's presenting us with is the fact that it's unsustainable. It really stands in contrast with the goals that we've laid out for ourselves to, bless you, to live within the boundaries of our planet. And right now, fashion is the second most polluting industry in the world, second only to oil. And it's also one of the largest consumers and polluters of water. And you guys know this isn't just an issue. The water crisis isn't just something that's affecting the developing world far away from us. It's now hitting us in the United States, and specifically out in California. So the water crisis is a really, really important one we have to get a handle on in the fashion industry. Again, here we are back in Bangladesh. And a lot of Bangladesh's water pollution is coming specifically from the leather industry. And a lot of leather is being sourced out of Bangladesh because it's cheap, and it's cheap because the industry isn't regulated. So all of the toxins that come out of tanning leather, which is already an incredibly toxic process, are just going straight into the water. And this is obviously bad for the people who work in the industry, but it's also bad for the people in Bangladesh who depend on that waterway. And this is a photo taken by Greenpeace in China. China is having a similar problem with unregulated pollution of water from textile mills. So this is dye that's coming out of a cluster of clothing mills that make children's clothing. And it's not an isolated problem. There's over 400 similar discharge points along China's coastline releasing contaminated wastewater. But let's say we could get a handle on the pollution, which that certainly needs to be a goal of ours, in fashion. It doesn't change the fact that in order to create so much new clothes, it just does require a lot of energy, a lot of natural resources, a lot of water. That's just the fact. And if you look at just the amount of fabric that's being produced around the world right now, it requires 1 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity and up to 9 trillion liters of water. Just for a simple t-shirt and pair of jeans requires 5,000 gallons of water and emits 7 pounds of CO2. So I think while we have these conversations about climate change in particular, I know the US, our goal is to reduce our carbon footprint by 28% from 2005 levels, I believe, by 2025. And in my opinion, we're really not looking in our closets enough in terms of how to answer that question. I think in some ways, fashion is the problem that's staring us in the face when it comes to climate change. I think it's clear we need a revolution in fashion. And going back to what I said in the very beginning about whether we're moving forward and backward, I think that we have all the tools that we need to fix this industry. right now. And in some ways, they're already being implemented. Last week was Fashion Revolution Week, which is held on the anniversary of Rana Plaza. And it was so inspiring to see consumers and garment workers around the world demanding that brands reveal who made their clothes and how their clothes were made and what conditions in order to put pressure on brands to be more accountable to their workers. We're also seeing young people coming out of fashion school and starting new fashion companies that have sustainability and ethics built into their DNA from the ground up. You don't have to tell these young people that these things are important. Reformation is a company based out on the West Coast that not only used upcycled and vintage materials, but they also own their own factory right here in the United States. Study New York is an independent fashion brand out of, actually she's based in Brooklyn, and she uses the historic garment district in New York City to make her clothes. In ASOS Africa, they have a fair trade line that is produced in Kenya, and I had an opportunity to go to their factory in January, and it was an incredible experience. And it's not just the little guys who are making a change. I see big brands having these conversations now. Levi's, for example, is pioneering new denim finishes that use a lot less water in their production process. Eileen Fisher is using certified dyeing, so their silks are dyed with non-toxic, low-impact dyes. We're also seeing companies closing the loop on fashion. So thinking ahead to what are we going to do with this piece of clothing once it's either worn out or just simply somebody doesn't want it anymore. And Freitag, I think they're German, they're pioneering biodegradable, compostable fabrics. How cool would that be if we could just put our clothes in the compost along with our eggshells and our banana peels and just let them break down. And then Evernew, based out on the West Coast, is pioneering a way to take old cotton garments and upcycle them into premium new cotton fabric. This is one of the most exciting things happening in the world of fashion. There are brands that are coming around today who are trying to retrain customers to value quality and to invest in better made products. So they're trying to reverse the culture of fast fashion. And this is just a handful of the companies that are doing this: Zadie, Quiana, and then Tom Cridland, which is based in the UK. And of course, there are people out there who also hope that we will just eventually print our clothes through a 3D printer, or even grow them ourselves. Suzanne Lee is a biologist and fashion designer who grew these garments out of kombucha, believe it or not. So here we are. We've come full circle to where I feel good about the future of the fashion industry, and I feel incredibly optimistic about the future of the fashion industry. One other thing I wanted to add in this area is the potential for reuse. Secondhand clothing in the United States, really around the world, has historically been associated with something that you do if you're poor, so if you're not able to buy new, or maybe it's like an eccentric niche thing. But I predict that it's going to be become much more mainstream, and that's thanks to the digital revolution. I think that we're going to be trading and swapping our clothes via internet tools and apps more than ever before, and the potential in that is really, really huge. So you can see here, if 1 in every 100 American households shopped resale this year, it would save over 99 billion gallons of water and 1.1 billion pounds of CO2 emissions. And again, it's easier than ever to find exactly what you want shopping secondhand, thanks to ThredUp and Tradesy, which are new mobile apps that make it easy for you to search for what you're looking for, as well as to sell things that you no longer want, and of course, eBay. But I kind of want to come back to this idea that I think that for any of this to really change, we're going to have a revolution of personal values, a revolution in the way we think about clothing. And in order for us to do that, I think that we're going to have to look to the past a little bit and embrace some more old-fashioned values about clothes and simply keep things for longer. And in fact, just by keeping clothes for 6 to 9 months longer, consumers can reduce the carbon, water, and waste impact of our wardrobes by as much as a third. And I think that that's something that we can all probably comfortably commit to, right? And I think that, it's really our power as individuals that excites me the most. And I think that the easiest thing that we can all do is simply slow down, buy less, buy better, and feel happier and more content with what we already have. Thank you. Thank you.
We're now going to take some questions from the audience. Feel free to raise your hand. Yeah.
This is such a broad-ranging topic. What was it that brought you to it originally?
It's a good question. The human rights part of it is how I got involved in kind of the fashion industry to begin with as an anti-sweatshop activist in college. But I talk about this in the beginning of the book. I also had kind of like a personal connection to the topic in that when I was growing up, I always shopped secondhand, and then as clothing got cheaper and trendier, I found myself shopping in this way that I describe. And in fact, I opened the book out by talking about how my moment of shame or my eureka moment was when I went to a Kmart and bought 7 pairs of shoes, the same shoes, for $7.99 a piece. And I was just carrying them back home on the subway in New York, and, they smelled like chemicals, and, they were heavy, and I was just like, what am I doing? And it was also just seeing the same transformation in my friends. Like maybe I was in an extreme case, but everybody I knew was kind of shopping the same way, and it made me wonder what the story was behind this dramatic shift in the way clothes are produced and sold. Thank you.
I wear out my clothes typically, but I still struggle with what to do with them once they're tattered. Mm-hmm. Do you have a recommendation for that? There are very few textile recycling places in the area.
You can still donate them to charities. Charities have relationships with textile sorters, so anything that they can't sell as clothing gets resold to the sorters, and the sorters sell it to recyclers. And if you want to make sure that's what they're going to do and not throw it away, I would just call beforehand and make sure. But traditionally, most of them have relationships with companies that also recycle. Then it ends up getting turned into anything from insulation to sometimes it's broken down and turned into wiping rags as well. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for your presentation. Personally, about 8 years ago, I curated an exhibition on eco-textiles, and I know it changed my consumption habits a lot. So I was wondering how, as you were going through the research, how this changed your consumption habits.
Yeah, sure. I would say the biggest transformation for me is that I don't really shop as much. And what I mean by that is I used to go out without any idea of what I was looking for. It was just sort of a sport, basically. I would just walk into a store and just be looking to spend money, and therefore I wouldn't really get the things that I wanted or needed. So now I kind of approach clothing with a lot more intention. So I am trying to work toward a wardrobe and I'll kind of make a list of the things that I'm looking for and look online first before I even step foot in a store, because I'm trying to really make sure that I buy things that I'm going to want to wear for a long time. And I think the other thing that changed a lot for me is that I became much more interested in materials and quality. So one of the first things that I look at when I'm buying clothes is the fabric, the fabrication. So like if somebody asks me what I'm wearing, I'll be like, I'm wearing wool, silk, cotton, and leather, and not, polyester, 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 polyester. So yeah.
This is a comment and a question, I guess. Just the fact that fast fashion is ubiquitous, but I see it like in small boutique shops in neighborhoods of high wealth demographics. So it's interesting to see how you see some of what we're looking at in H&M, and it's fast fashion is expensive actually in some of these boutique shops, and just kind of wondering if you've come across that. I come across it often. And then also just wondering if you, in your research and in your journey, consider that sustainable fashion will become more accessible, affordable, so that the triple bottom line, people, profit, and planets could be affordable.
Yeah, I think that we are going to have to adjust our expectations about price somewhat. I don't think it's reasonable to expect people to buy or pay $60 for an organic t-shirt or something like that, but I do think that we have to get out of the mindset of, I think we have to go back a little bit more into the mindset of feeling comfortable investing and saving up for a really good quality piece of clothing. And because when you start talking to people about how they spend money, you'll talk to someone who's like, I will never spend $100 on a piece of clothing, but they'll spend that much money on electronics or a car payment or even a night out for dinner and drinks. I think it kind of shows the way we value clothing. But as you brought up earlier, your comment about you will go into these smaller stores, these like higher end stores, and see the same like quality garments that you might find in a fast fashion chain, and it's marked way up. So the challenge as a consumer is you have to educate yourself to know the difference. And it sounds like you can walk into a store and be like, that's not worth my money, and that's where you get into like it being a journey of having to like re-educate people to even be able to recognize a good piece of clothing that is worth your money. And then the last part of it is I do think the price of ethically produced clothing will come down somewhat because we're seeing more American manufacturing, and I think it's really a problem of scale right now. It's such a small scale niche thing. So as the industry grows and people start collaborating more, I think it will become more affordable. Thank you. And sorry that was so long-winded.
Hey, I just wanted to say thank you for writing that book. I read that when I was working in supply chain in the fast fashion industry, and
Cool.
It helped me to kind of see what was going on that I kind of suspected but knew that was worse than I anticipated. So my question for you is, so do you think that there could ever be a full-scale change in the way clothing's marketed to kids? And, some of those hauls you showed, those are sponsored content, they're viral or whatever.
Yeah.
Not to mention the company would have like unpaid interns responding to every single tweet they'd get about a certain product. So I just feel like that some of the stuff is just, I don't know how you can change it,
I think you're hitting on something really important that I just touched on in my talk, which is how all this impacts teenagers, and the struggle for parents too, who see their kids kind of trying to keep up with the pressure on them to buy stuff all the time. And you're right; these brands are working with kids to basically using them as free marketing, giving them products to promote on the internet. It doesn't make me feel like we can't do anything about it. I just think that bringing the message of fast fashion into high schools, for example, and talking about it more in colleges is really important. I partnered with the Fashion Institute of Technology to start talking about the idea of disposable fashion in college classrooms. But yeah, I think you're right. It absolutely has to, that message has to be brought to younger people who these companies are directly marketing to in really troubling ways.
One of the questions I have is the people portion of the triple bottom line, which is the labor portion. If your research you're developing your research, there's some legislation that's coming out, like the UK Modern Anti-Slavery Act, and it's been used in the fishing industry to combat egregious labor practices. And I'm wondering if you came across that in terms of the textile industry and the clothing industry, and how impactful that legislation may or may not be.
I'm not familiar with that specific piece of legislation, but I will say that without better regulations and new laws to regulate the fashion industry, there's not going to be a whole lot of change especially on the level that these big global corporations are operating at. So I think that, our responsibility as citizens is as big as our responsibility as consumers in this matter. And I will absolutely look into that legislation because is it something that they're talking about doing here as well?
I think so. I think that
Yeah.
talk about it in the US. What's interesting in the UK is that if you are a public company, this is what I think I read, is that if you're a public company under the UK Modern Anti-Slavery Act, you have to do a disclosure for building on that gentleman's discussion with supply chain, is you have to build into a disclosure with your public filings that you are committed to saying, I do not use convict or the equivalent of convict labor in my supply chain. And the difficulty for these huge corporations when they're talking about the use of multiple buying agents and multiple factories, how is that actually being executed and implemented?
Right, but the onus should be on them to figure it out, because right now what they do, most brands are they commit themselves to these voluntary codes of conduct. So they're not even legally required they're not legally responsible for the people in their supply chain. And that's why we've seen things like what's happening in Bangladesh, because the brands are like, that's not on me, that's not my problem. And then the government in Bangladesh doesn't have either the money, power, out of corruption, the will to change. So I do think there definitely has to be better legislation, and that's a conversation we haven't even had about the fashion industry in 20 years, is how do we legislate this industry now that it's global? And that's a really massive undertaking, but it's something that we kind of have to start working through if we want to fix some of this.
We have one more question right over here.
Hi, I want to thank you for doing this to humanity, to the world at this point. My question to you is, which cause are you more inclined to? Are you anti-sweatshops, or are you fighting for better conditions at sweatshops? I ask this because if we are anti-sweatshops, we will be depriving people of the $68 that they're earning a month.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a false choice. I'm not, what were my options? Pro sweatshop or?
No. Anti-sweatshops or fighting for better conditions at sweatshops, because you mentioned both in your presentation.
Right. I've been asked that before, and I think that what I want to see is a better regulated, more humane fashion industry. And as I pointed out in my presentation, I think it's entirely possible because we've done it before. It takes organized labor, it takes a functional government, it takes brands and retailers working with government. And I hope that that's a place that we can get to. Absolutely.
All right, we are just out of time, but Elizabeth will be signing books in the front of the room, and there are books available for sale at the back.
Thank you so much. Thank you.